I regard golf as an expensive way of playing marbles. The riddles of God are more satisfying than the solutions of man. Never be afraid to try something new. Remember, professionals built the Titanic, but an amateur built the Ark. Life is too important to be taken seriously. Why do angels fly? Because they take themselves lightly. And here is a definition of childhood. 100 windows open on all sides of your head. Never let a quarrel get in the way of a good argument. And finally, the things we see every day are the things we never see at all. Masterful quotations from G.K. Chesterton, a formidable philosopher in all realms. Chesterton, 6'4" in height, weighing between 300 and 400 pounds. And you know what else? A lady once said to him, "Why don't you just turn sideways when you're trying to get out that door?" He said, "Madam, there is no sideways." Chesterton was a novelist, a poet, an essayist, a journalist, and a debater, and an all-around jovial kind of person. Want to know who was on his cricket team? Why, besides Chesterton, it was A.A. Milne. Where's my person?
Oh, here, I went here.
Oh, okay. All right.
I thought it'd be easier to see me.
Okay. Thank you. A.A. Milne, the author of Winnie the Pooh. Who else was on his cricket team? H.G. Wells, author of The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds. Rudyard Kipling, The Jungle Book. J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan. Who else was on his cricket team? Arthur Conan Doyle, of Sherlock Holmes fame. And finally, G.K. Chesterton, who wrote Father Brown. They weren't very serious at what they were doing, but they did have a great time. For them, playing cricket was a lark. And here was another lark as well. Let's see, now, there we go. This is an actual photograph of a movie that was entitled Rosy Rapture, done about 1907, and it's a silent film. The director of the film is J.M. Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan. Next to him is G.K. Chesterton, and finally, George Bernard Shaw to the right. It was a cowboy film, and it was a lark. Chesterton also influenced a wide variety of persons in politics. The single most the single most important impression that he made upon anybody was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a great fan of Chesterton, and when Roosevelt was touring in London, he demanded that Chesterton have dinner with him. and concluded that Chesterton was the most jovial, most intelligent conversationalist of all time. There were also other presidents who quoted Chesterton repeatedly: Woodrow Wilson, Ronald Reagan, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and also in the political realm, Martin Luther King. Chesterton is also known for a distinctive invention of an economic system that is called distributism. That particular aspect of economics basically said this, that if you have a system of economics based on capitalism, then corporations will control your life. If you have a system of government that's based upon socialism, then the state, the government, will control your life. Chesterton, along with Hilary Belloc, invented distributism, which basically said, let's leave it to the family. Let's leave it to local communities. Let's create a system that manifests the greatest degree of humanity and creativity possible. And you know what? There was a certain man who read Chesterton relative to economics, and it changed his life. And that man was Gandhi. The one experiment that was given to bring into actuality the system of Chesterton was actually performed by Gandhi. Chesterton, who liked to drink, he was in a bar one night. He decided to write an essay. The essay was called Indian Nation. And as a result of that essay, which Gandhi read, Gandhi then formulated a book of his own that was based upon Chesterton and tried to put into practice the ethics of distributism as far as his own work was concerned. Also, there was another writer in about 1970 by the name of E.F. Schumacher, who wrote a book that was entitled Small is Beautiful. And more than anything else, that book, if you remember it from those days, was a summary of Buddhist economics and Chestertonian distributism. And in the process of Schumacher discovering Chesterton, Fritz Schumacher became a Christian. His influence, Chesterton's influence in literature is expansive. First of all, Franz Kafka admired Chesterton's fanciful way of writing, and Kafka said of Chesterton, he's so jolly, I'm beginning to suspect that he knows God. Ernest Hemingway wrote about Chesterton in one of his novels. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote about Chesterton in one of his novels. Jorge Luis Borges was massively influenced by Chesterton and originated more or less a Latin American version of literature, which is to this day called magical realism. You might say that Chesterton was not only responsible for the Indian liberation of India from the British, but also responsible for Latin American literature. Then, Neil Gaiman, a contemporary fanciful writer, he, along with Terry Pratchett, wrote a book which was totally dedicated to their hero, G.K. Chesterton. And finally, in literature, one man who was very much influenced by Chesterton, Ray Bradbury. Chesterton also had his influence within the context of the movies and entertainment in general. Orson Welles, for example, was deeply influenced by Chesterton. And remember, he did the War of the Worlds radio broadcast in 1938 on Halloween, and the whole East Coast got a little frantic because of the Martians landing. 2 weeks before that, Orson Welles, on his radio program with the Mercury Theater, had actually performed a piece of radio drama by none other than G.K. Chesterton. Furthermore, Alfred Hitchcock was deeply influenced by Chesterton. Not only did he have the Chesterton knack for twisting the plot and all of that, but you remember he was sort of impish, you know, that profile and that funny way of talking and that funny music on the TV show, you know, that was the theme song. That's all Chesterton. Chesterton loved to debate with other people. And at a given point, he debated not only with H.G. Wells, but also with Bertrand Russell, the famous Oxford philosopher who wrote the book entitled Why I Am Not a Christian, George Bernard Shaw, who was Chesterton's deep friend, but also a socialist vegetarian. And then finally, when Chesterton came to the United States, he debated Clarence Darrow, who was fresh out of the Scope trials, having brutalized William Jennings Bryan, the opposing lawyer, to the extent that Jennings Bryan actually died a week later. Darrow thought that Chesterton was just another pathetic fundamentalist. So they came together in this debate in New York City. Darrow gave his introduction in which he attacked Chesterton as being a fundamentalist. He was brutal. Chesterton rose to the occasion and says, "Mr. Darrow, I agree with everything you said." Clarence Darrow was destroyed. They took a vote after the debate, and they discovered that Chesterton had won it handily. Here's the curious thing about G.K. When he debated, which was frequent, he would always state the case of his opponent better than his opponent had actually stated it. He did not conquer his enemies. He absorbed them. And let me tell you this. Everybody who came up against them, this is my opinion, debated him with their mind. Chesterton debated them with his soul. And so he was large enough to blow them away, to enchant the audience, and to charm the adversary into a good friend. If there's anything that's remarkable about Chesterton, he had remarkable friendships that lasted throughout his life. And of course, he made a monumental contribution in the life of religion. And who did he influence? Why? Alan Watts, who many of you read in the 60s and 70s. He was a former Episcopalian priest and therefore influenced by Chesterton's writing. And Watts had the same kind of witty humor as Chesterton did, if you remember reading his books. Then C.S. Lewis, at a point in his life, remember he grew up as an avid atheist. And then he participated in World War I. There was a bomb or a missile that came in his direction. It killed 2 men on either side of him, 2 of his friends. And Lewis was wounded at that time. He was sent to the hospital, and while he was in the hospital, he read G.K. Chesterton and became converted out of his atheism. Lewis basically said this: "It is a dangerous thing for anyone to ever read Chesterton. Lewis's friend, who was very instrumental in converting Lewis to Christianity, was J.R.R. Tolkien. And Tolkien's imagination relative to fairy tales and all of that kind of thing was directly influenced by G.K. Chesterton. Finally, our topic for today, which has to do with detective mysteries and the like. Chesterton was elected to be the president of the London Detective Club. And not only was Chesterton a member, but also Agatha Christie. And let me tell you this, when it comes to detective mysteries. Chesterton defined a detective mystery as the pleasure of being fooled when you're reading it. The pleasure of being deceived. The pleasure of being outsmarted. And that was, in other words, people who read detective stories better get used to humility. Let me tell you a silly thing now about Sherlock Holmes, which we covered a few months ago. At a given point, remember, Arthur Conan Doyle hated writing about Sherlock Holmes and tried to put an end to him. Couldn't do it. At a given point, Doyle wrote a particular episode of Sherlock Holmes. You know, Holmes would have all these different clients that would show up with all these different needs. In this particular episode that Doyle is writing, who's the client? It's G.K. Chesterton. And Chesterton, as a result of this, leads Sherlock Holmes on a wild goose chase. And who else is in this particular episode? Why, President Teddy Roosevelt, who they came to know, Harry Houdini, if you remember that name, and guess who else appears in that episode? Arthur Conan Doyle himself. He broke all the rules. Chesterton's versions of a detective was Father Brown, and Father Brown is based upon an actual person who influenced Chesterton in his becoming a Christian. And that man's name is Father John O'Connor. And Chesterton describes what Father Brown looks like by saying, in any given crowd, you would always take him as being invisible, primarily because his face looks like a dumpling. Let me tell you this. One man who played Father Brown in a full-length movie in 1952 was named Sir Alec Guinness. And Guinness played Father Brown, looks just like him. And as a result of that, Alec Guinness became a Christian. Now, what we know about these days is the BBC version that's broadcast on PBS, which is Father Brown, and that stars Mark Williams. And Mark Williams, you might recognize, actually as the father in Harry Potter. So he's in that as well. Okay, now, Father Brown is very different from Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is an aristocrat of facticity. He is an example of forensic investigation at a high level. He, in a certain sense, is a premier snot when it comes to detection. By contrast, Father Brown is the ordinary person. In fact, he's a bumbler, he's a blunderer, he's a simpleton. He hardly knows anything. He just shows up in various situations and starts asking questions. He does not use the facts to come to a conclusion as to who did it. Instead, what he does is he looks into his own shadow until he can find within himself that portion of himself that would have or could have committed that crime. And when he knows of the criminal inside himself, then he is able to identify who the criminal is outside of himself. Now, he is not interested in solving a crime. He is interested in saving a soul. And the truth is this, that according to Father Brown, a person will actually set a trap for them by becoming a criminal because of their deep need to finally face themselves. So the crime, in a certain sense, becomes a mirror for self-reflection, for understanding who you are. The soul arranges for that intimate entrapment called a crime for the sake of saving one's own soul. Do you understand? Wow. And furthermore, Father Brown knows a lot about criminality, primarily because, as a priest, he's heard so many disgusting confessions over all of those years. He knows the human shadow better than anybody. So either he finds the criminal aspect of himself inside himself, or he understands that it's not necessarily the case that the criminal is longing to be punished, but the criminal, in their deepest truth, is wanting to be unveiled, as in confession. As Chesterton said, the most important thing about confession is that in order to do it, you have to love the truth of who you are. You have to face the truth of who you are. So Father Brown is interested in seeing where the trap is, where the entrapment is, in order to come to a place to figure out exactly what's going on. Now, as the simpleton, what he does is he asks stupid questions in odd circumstances and looks for things in odd locations. Father Brown is not interested in the arrogance of convicting somebody for the crime through the intelligence of facticity, as Sherlock Holmes was. Father Brown wants to ask obnoxious questions that would allow the criminal to actually stumble into their own confession. So in other words, he knows enough about confession to be able to arrange it. Therefore, solving a crime basically means facilitating a self-confrontation and not a triumph. In a certain sense, Father Brown has the same style as Chesterton had as a debater. He didn't want to conquer somebody, to love them outrageously with great mirth. So here's the other thing with Father Brown. If you watch the PBS episodes, he'll do this every now and then. because he's trying to reflect upon heaven to let him know who committed the crime. So here's what Chesterton says that comes through with Father Brown. You must look for the horseplay of the invisible. You must look for the horseplay of the invisible. Or you must look for what Chesterton calls, not synchronicities, because that's too technical a term, to look for elfin coincidences, where God winks, where heavenly meanings are revealed in physical events. Rumi called this the secret laughter of events. Chesterton called it the horseplay of the invisible. And so, remember that quote, basically? The things that you can't see are the things that you see every day. Father Brown was just stupid enough not to take anything for granted. So he saw the extraordinary in the ordinary. What we're dealing with Father Brown? He's a mystic of the first order. And that's why Chesterton wrote a book entitled Tremendous Trifles, because those trifles give hope and meaning and ordinary joy to every moment of our life. Do you understand Father Brown? Do you appreciate him? Now, the closest influence that I can tell you that Chesterton had upon the whole field of detection is manifest in an American version of Father Brown, which you probably grew up watching on TV, and that is, that's our Father Brown. Now, let me summarize just a few things about Chesterton. More than anything else, right at the center of Chesterton is the concept of mirth. And mirth is different than wit. Wit basically comes from the head, but mirth comes from the belly. When we practice wit, we will usually, from our heads, destroy others. When we practice mirth, which erupts spontaneously from our belly, we will be destroyed in the process. Or as Chesterton said, all jokes are undignified because that's the best way to help the soul. In other words, if you can get over yourself as the ultimate joke, in all probability you will practice mirth for the rest of your life, and you won't even need the cynicism of wit anymore. And in our culture right now, the cynicism of wit dominates everything. And so if you have a simpleton in a crowd who is able to deliver mirth or arrange for mirth, that's a totally different experience. In a way, mirth erupts spontaneously. It's sort of a given of the way in which human beings, if they're able to be tender and simple with one another, that kind of beautiful laughter will actually erupt. As Chesterton said it, laughter is our most beloved form of beautiful madness. It saves us from the tyranny of reason. Or in our day, it saves us from the tyranny of politics. God bless you.